All right, welcome to the Summit Bid Gallery. Today we're gonna tick off some Sony fanboys and talk about why I learned to hate Sony, but also we're gonna talk about how this Sony camera brought me back. All right, so my story with Sony goes all the way back to the first interchangeable lens camera. Well, actually the first camera I ever purchased for myself, the Sony a7sIII. Now, those of you out there who have heard of this camera before probably know this is an A-mount camera, but it had the same menu systems, a similar ergonomics, similar interface. And you know, I used that camera and subsequently the a6000 and the a6500 for really the first 3 years of me being interested in video work and photo work. Really, I learned on those cameras. And because of that, you know, kind of in the back of my head, I've always felt like a Sony shooter. And I loved the a7sIII and the a6000. Those cameras were amazing. And it wasn't until I started doing some more professional work, some more, let's say, work for clients or where I felt like I was under a little bit more pressure and I desired a little bit more usability and quality out of my cameras that, you know, around the time I had the a6500, that I began to see some issues with Sony. And we're gonna get into those a little bit more, but before we do, I kinda wanna go over the list of things that, you know, drew me to Sony as a brand new person interested in the industry. And I think what drew a lot of people into Sony, both people who'd been shooting for 50 years and people brand new like myself. So here's the 5 things that I think a lot of people love Sony for. They're very feature-rich cameras. You know, they're going to have at least 1 or 2 specs that are pretty cutting edge. May that be that the autofocus is really fast, or the resolution is high, or the video specs are really good. There's something on the camera that it's going to do that's kind of cutting edge, and that's great. And something that honestly Canon and Nikon have kind of failed to do a few times, you know, bringing out something new that, you know, you might, you know, that's something you want when you're spending thousands of dollars on a new camera, is something new, and Sony almost always brings that to the table. They also kind of enrich this concept with their cameras as well by giving them a lot of customization. You know, you can really customize these cameras well, although I do feel like some of the customization is a little surface level. You know, being able to customize what every button on the camera does is great, but you know, it's not necessarily as deep as like having more user modes or more customization within user-defined modes and etc. like you might find on a Nikon camera. That really comes across as feeling like a little bit of an extra level of customization that oftentimes I find Sony doesn't necessarily offer. Another thing would be a decent price. Now, lately, Sony has been slipping on this a little bit more, but it's important to mention that when the a7, the original one, came out, it was actually, I believe, about $600 cheaper than its closest competitor, which would have been the Canon 6D, the original 6D. And Sony's kind of followed through with that, always kind of providing at least one offering that really gives good value for money. Another example of this would be the Sony a7 III, which offered crazy features at a price that was kind of unheard of. I mean, the 6D Mark II came out just months before the a7 III, and the a7 III blew that camera out of the water with the feature set it had, and it was the same price. Another thing that people love about Sony cameras is they, relatively speaking, feel future-proof. In other words, when you get a camera that has cutting-edge features, it definitely makes it feel like it's the kind of camera that you are going to be able to use for many years to come. Another thing I think a lot of people love about Sony's, and a drawing factor, is small and lightness. And this is something Sony's very focused on. A great example of how small and light they can get is this 20mm f1.8, which is shockingly smaller than what Nikon's 20mm f1.8 is. I wouldn't necessarily call it a ton lighter. I think it is a little bit lighter, but you know, this is something people switch to Sony for, especially back when, you know, I was first starting getting my a58 and everything. And then, you know, the last thing I think a lot of people switch to Sony for is the image quality. You know, Sony has a reputation, particularly in video, of offering the best image quality. And, you know, all of these things, I'm gonna kind of start with the image quality, but all of these things were things that I bought Sony cameras for, and I found that the Sony cameras kind of didn't deliver, or at least they didn't deliver as much as I wanted them to. And the image quality is one I really want to zoom in on, because I feel like the image quality spot is a place where a lot of people, particularly for video, maybe very specifically for video shooters, can get kind of misled by marketing. So Sony cameras for a long time now have featured 4K as like a main feature. The a6300, the a7S II, and every a6000 camera since then has really featured that 4K downsampled from 6K really sharp image. And yes, if you point even an a6300 at a brick wall and hit record for a minute or two, you're gonna get an incredible looking sharp image. But the problem with Sony's image quality, particularly for video, again, that's what I do, so that's the main thing we're gonna be talking about, is there's a lot of devils in the detail. Devils in the detail? There's devils in the details of Sony image quality, and that's a huge part of the reason that drove me away from Sony. But one of those devils in the details is rolling shutter. Rolling shutter is actually a big issue for me because I find myself deep in the mountains sometimes needing to shoot handheld and, you know, not necessarily being in terrain where it's easy to soft walk or get my camera on a gimbal or really do anything like that. You know, I just kind of need to point the camera at something and, you know, pan around and stuff, or maybe walk forward a couple steps during the shot. And rolling shutter really in that context makes what would already be kind of shaky footage, it makes it kind of nauseating. This was particularly bad on the a6500 in my experience. And you know, you could fix that by shooting in, say, 1080 60p or 1080 24p, but you know, I bought this camera to shoot 4K with it, not to shoot the pretty subpar 1080. So that was just something that was really frustrating. Another frustrating thing is the color, particularly, once again, in video. The 8-bit codecs on these cameras looked pretty good in standard picture profile. But the problem with standard picture profiles, as I'm sure you've probably heard many people go on about on YouTube at this time, is that they don't have a lot of dynamic range. In other words, it's really hard to get a blue sky looking good and blue and not just blown out white, and also get shadows also showing detail as well. So it's hard to get that full range of detail. And on Sony's cameras, when you switch to S-Log, what you'll find yourself dealing with, and in HLG to some degree, is that the colors start falling apart. Now, the exact reason behind this is partially not Sony's fault. It's partially that it's an 8-bit codec, and Sony's, to Sony's credit, actually gives us the ability to use S-Log, and other camera companies like Nikon here makes you shoot in 10-bit. But just in general, it's pretty hard to get good looking color with an 8-bit codec in log. It's just difficult to get that tonality, and without banding or yellow skin and stuff. And for me, that issue is compounded by my color blindness. Since I'm colorblind actually somewhat specifically within the skin tone range, it's really hard for me to even see if skin tones are shifting a little yellow or a little green or something. And to kind of maybe put the heat on Sony a little bit here, I've used log 8-bit codecs now from Canon and from Panasonic a little bit as well. And I have to be honest with you, I have not experienced the same amount of color issues from those camera companies as I have from Sony within 8-bit log profiles. I think that Sony needed to just up the amount of megabits per second on those cameras and give them a little bit more room to breathe. But Sony never did do that on any of their 8-bit cameras, despite the fact I do think that Sony did improve their color problems from the a6500. There was a bump at the a7 III and another bump, in my opinion, to the a6600. Each camera got a little bit better, and of course, their bump over here. Another issue to me is going to be kind of that small and light thing. Yes, they're small, really small, and they're pretty light as well, but the lenses are hit or miss on whether they are small and light or not. This is a great example of one that is really small and light, but if you put, say for example, their 24-70 2.8 out there, that lens is actually bigger than a lot of the other lenses and heavier. So, you know, you end up with this tiny kind of fiddly camera body with ergonomics that, in my opinion, aren't amazing, particularly on the a6500. And you put giant lenses on it, or you have to put giant lenses on it. Like, it just doesn't work that well. Once again, kind of a reason why people buy it's for small and light, but when you actually get in the system, you realize that it's kind of difficult to go small and light. You have to do very specific things. The good price ratio thing, well, I mean, for the most part, I think Sony holds up with that pretty well, but the problem that you have to ask yourself is do any of these other problems kind of undermine the savings? Are you better off getting a camera that doesn't have as many features, but doesn't have rolling shutter issues, or shoots in log a little bit better? And, you know, this is a huge part of the reason why, you know, if I had an a7 III on the table or an EOS R on the table, two cameras I've used quite a bit, you know, I would pick the EOS R over the a7 III, not because necessarily the a7 III is a worse video camera, but because there's just so many little fiddly annoyances with Sony's older cameras, particularly for what I do and particularly for video, that I just am more pleased with the image, even shooting in 1080 primarily off the EOS R. And that brings me to this camera, the Sony a7S Mark III. What the Sony a7S Mark III does, I think, is the Sony a7S Mark III really moves the bar up on everything we love about Sony, and even solves some of the things that Sony has struggled with. A great example of that is feature richness. This camera is extremely feature rich from a videography perspective, of course, but still extremely feature rich. You've got pretty much any spec I could think of wanting on this camera. You've got 1080 240, you've got 4K 120, both well implemented. Of course, the 1080 240 has some unfortunate artifacting, and it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's really nice to have that, and realistically what I really wanted was 4K 120. And you've got the flip screen, something Sony was missing for a really long time. You know, you've got a full-size HDMI port when you're using a Ninja V. I mean, Sony's just really honed this camera in really well, in my opinion. And, you know, as far as value goes, this camera, from a videography perspective, actually does come in $400 cheaper than the R5 and a few $1,000s cheaper than the A1. Really good value for money. It's also really future-proof, in my opinion. You know, when I think about this camera and I think about myself 2 or 3 years from now, I honestly think I could use this camera no problem. It has the features you need. It has great autofocus, it's got the flip screen, it's got IS, it's got all of those features you need to kind of look into the future and be like, yeah, I mean, I could totally foresee doing bigger projects farther into the future with this than most other cameras. You know, it's a little bit bigger, but it's still not nearly as large as most of the other full frame mirrorless cameras. So I guess that's nice in my opinion. I don't really think you need to make cameras that much smaller, but you know, that's just me maybe. Another thing that I think that this camera, and once again, hitting hard on this image quality thing, The image quality coming off the a7S III really is a step above. And it's a step above not just what Sony's made, but it's a step above what other camera companies have made as well. And the reason why is because Sony's bringing those resolution features. It has 4K, it has high frame rate, you know, the flashy things we think about. But Sony's also really limited things like rolling shutter. It's still there, but the handheld footage off the Sony a7S III is maybe the favorite, or my favorite I've ever shot with. And the reason why is because on cameras like the R5 and the Z7, you end up with a little bit of that almost kind of rolling shutter artifacting from the IS because it's so strong. You know, people talk about the corners warping a lot on YouTube videos, and that really isn't the most pleasing look. It just doesn't give a good handheld first impression, if you will. And can once again kind of lend itself to that kind of seasick look that can happen, especially when you add into the fact that both the R5 and the Z7 do have more rolling shutter, in my experience, than the S3 does. Then you move into the color department. The S3 shoots 10-bit, and it's a really robust, nice 10-bit codec that can be fairly compressed down, so it's not ginormous file sizes. Like, Sony really hit the mark with this camera with the image quality issues, because I'm not running into as many skin tone issues as I was with previous Sony cameras, but I'm getting a lot of the advantages that Sony brings. I mean, it really is an incredible showing from Sony, solving lots of problems that I've found with previous cameras, and that's really a breath of fresh air. You know, Sony's been known for a long time to be a camera company that listens to its customers. You know, that's one of the other things people love about Sony, and I feel like finally Sony actually listened to my problems with this camera, which is really great. A few other things that I've just have found to be frustrating with Sony in the past has been the bad ergonomics, and I wouldn't say that Sony has really honed that in too well with this particular camera, but I do find that the ergonomics are at least better. I still find that the Z7 line and Canon's mirrorless cameras and DSLRs, they all feel a little bit better in the hand than Sony's do. It's kind of just, I mean, I think it's probably because they've been making cameras for quite a bit longer than Sony has. And they're a little less addicted to the small and light thing, but just little things like the fact that on the Z7 II here, the grip actually bumps up and gives you the shutter button and 3 custom buttons actually on where your pointer finger is. One of the most important areas where you're going to be interacting with it a lot. You know, Nikon just built that a lot better than even on the a7S III here with the Sony's newest camera body design. You can see how instead of popping up to give my fingers more room on the grip, it actually slides down. There's no other buttons on here except for the shutter button here, and then there's just 2 extra buttons on the back here instead of 3. And you know, in my opinion, that's just worse design. Sony's just losing out in that regard. With, you know, exception of, you know, maybe it's nice that the playback button is on this side, meaning you can essentially control the entire camera with your right hand. I really do think that Nikon nailed their camera bodies a lot better than Sony has. But Sony's getting better. Once again, Sony does tend to continuously improve their cameras and continuously target issues that I have. There's just so many things about this camera that it gets right that a lot of other camera companies out there, I think, are struggling with. And the reason why, the base reason why, is because, you know, I'm a videographer first and foremost, and this camera is a camcorder in a stills body, and that's really what I wanted. I wanted a camera that wouldn't be giving me things like record limits or ridiculous amounts of overheating or maybe vast differences in image quality depending on frame rate, or maybe it doesn't have log internal, or Maybe it has sort of warpy, not amazing looking IS because it's IS that's really more built for stills than it is for video. Or, you know, there's a lot of things that, like Nikon's cameras, even though I think they're getting really close to making a really compelling video camera, they're just not there yet. And Sony nailed it with this camera. Now, obviously, if you're out there and you're watching this and you're like, but I shoot 50% stills and 50% video, and you know, the Sony a7S III just doesn't have the stills specs that I really want. Absolutely, the R5 is better, or the A1 if you have the budget is a better option. But if you're video first and you have the budget to get this camera, I really think that the Sony a7S III is amazing, and it's brought me back to Sony, and I really didn't think that that was going to happen because of all of the problems that I've had with Sony in the past. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked it, definitely hit that like button. And if you have any questions or want to share your own experience with Sony, maybe the good and the bad, definitely drop a comment down below. If you've left Sony for good, let me know why, especially if it's for video, and what you switched to. I'm sure that myself and many other videographers would be really interested in hearing what you chose to switch to, the compromises you were willing to make. Yeah, and I will see you on the next adventure.